Welcome to Troy. We're so pleased to have you here today. The city has a long industrial history and before that a commercial history which has made it what it is today. Known as the Collar City because of the collar and cuff industry that was here and became worldwide in the mid and later 19th and early 20th centuries. Troy has been a leader in many ways of innovation and technology and all sorts of things and continues that history today. I'm Stacy Pomeroy Draper, retired recently as curator for the Hart-Cluett Museum here in Troy, and we are in the Hart-Cluett House. The city became a city in 1816. It had been a village and a town before that. By 1820 or thereabouts, all sorts of things were happening. The population had grown to over 5,000. Trade and commerce were the main things. It was at the top of the navigable Hudson River, so this was where navigation pretty much stopped. Water really was the main force, the main power source. It provided shipping, and when the canal was opened in 1825 and really began to start changing things going west, there was good clay in the area, so brickmaking was one of the industries that took off because of the river flooding over the centuries. Even today, there are 6 bridges that go across the Hudson in this location. The next big thing was going to be industry, heavy industry, things like iron, textiles, which really made Troy known throughout the world as the century went on.
A few years later, we have Lafayette that comes back and he visits Troy.
Lafayette visited Troy on September 18th, 1824, and he spent almost the full day here. He arrived and was greeted by the Troy committee that had gotten together to take him through the city, and the city recorder met him. The militia was there, the bands were there, the people were there. And from the foot of Ferry Street, they made a kind of a parade up First Street, over Congress, up Second Street, over to Third, where some of the churches were, up Third to River, and then back down River Street to the location of the Troy House, which was where he was going to be officially greeted by everybody. In 1820, unfortunately, there was a very big fire in the main commercial district right along the river on River Street, and it burned down a good portion of the center of the community's commercial activity. Within 6 months, they had rebuilt.
Do you think we can say that his visit tells a story of resilience for the community?
It is noted in the newspapers that, just several years ago, we thought we were done for, and I'm paraphrasing there, they didn't use that terminology. And here the nation's guest was arriving, and it was a big celebration. It really was. In part, of course, because he was coming as the last remaining general of the American Revolution. And there were people who had lived through that still in the community, as there were all through his visit. That was really important, that Troy was chosen as one of the cities to have him actually come and spend a day was a big deal. The other part of it was that the community itself recognized how the community had progressed since the Revolution, which was just, as he said, a small grouping of houses and a ferry crossing, a small ferry crossing, to a big city, a really beautiful city. So he arrives, and he had to have been blown away by the changes he'd seen. I mean, he'd come up during the Revolution and there was virtually nothing here. I think he said he tried to get a piece of cornbread and a cup of milk to eat, on his visit here, and it was hard to do even that.
What do you make of this connection that Lafayette establishes between economic prosperity that he sees throughout the country is a direct consequence of the Republican institutions of the United States.
It was a very interesting time. It was a time of great division politically. It was a time of transition between a sort of agrarian community economy and a more industrialized commercial economy. And I think that's one reason why Lafayette was invited to come by the president. I think he understood that this might draw people together in a way and make them reflect upon what the revolution really meant and its democratic ideals and how a democracy should be working. And you come to Troy, which is right in the midst of all these transitions. It's a good model for what was going on in the rest of the country. It was taken as a sign of how far the country had come and the community itself had come.
In 1825, the French author Stendhal, wrote a book, D'un nouveau complot contre les industriels, that's the name of the book in French, in which he opposed the selfishness of the industrials looking to make money and the selflessness of heroes like Lafayette. But it looks like in America, and in Troy specifically, the two were not exactly opposed as Stendhal was writing it. What do you make of that?
I think that's true. You find in the early history of the community that both men and women got together, maybe separately, but they grouped around certain community efforts that really improved the community. Things like the education system, things like helping people who were impoverished in some way. Although the community was growing rapidly, and in part because the community was growing rapidly, the systems that were, to keep things going were not necessarily quite in place. They had to catch up in some way. So the community was trying to look at different kinds of ways to help people better themselves.
And would these, I will call them industrials, also be involved in supporting the female seminary?
Absolutely. Richard Hart and his wife had 14 children, 10 of whom were girls, 9 of whom went to the female seminary. He had a kind of vested interest in making that work, but the community supported it as well. After lunch at the Troy House, he was given an invitation to go down a few blocks to the Troy Female Seminary to meet with Mrs. Willard, Emma Willard, and the ladies of the community. The young women were there. There was music that had been composed by Mrs. Willard that welcomed him, and the young ladies sang for him. And there was a whole, as much pomp and ceremony there as there was with the military bands and the speeches up at the Troy House.
Why do you think Lafayette went to the female seminary?
I believe he'd been in correspondence with Emma Willard about education, female education, but he definitely wanted to see her school, which was innovative in that it provided schooling in the same subjects that young men were studying.
What kind of political statements was Lafayette making when he visited the female seminary here in Troy?
The statement he was making, I think, was giving it credence that females should be educated along with males. And it was still a very new idea. And the idea of sending your daughter to school was quite different, especially to study the topics from languages to arts to sciences. That was a big step for somebody in those days to do.
At the entrance of the female seminary, there was an arch that the ladies erected for Lafayette. And I think one of the messages on it was, we welcome our deliverer, I think, the deliverer of women. To me, it strikes me as the same narrative of freedom from oppression.
I mean, he had some very novel ideas pretty early, particularly if it was about women's suffrage and women's rights. He certainly was saying that the education was the key.
To me, I think the visit to Troy is super important because it talks about the universalism that Lafayette cherishes, but it also comes in companionship with a praise of American republicanism. And to me, to see the festivity in Troy, the economic prosperity, it's a perfect mix for him to tell his story.
I go back to the idea that it was a time in many ways like our own, where some of these issues, which have still not gotten totally resolved, women's rights, human rights, the universalism you were talking about, those are still issues we are struggling with in many ways.
What is the legacy of Lafayette today?
He still stands out as a sort of a bright light, if you will, not just for what he did when he was 19 and came over here to assist in the effort to form our nation, but his lifelong legacy. He was way ahead of his time. And we need to go back to people like that and say, yes, this was the idea. We still need to work on it. He definitely was a person of consequence who could say things that many people didn't maybe want to hear and that many people wanted said. He continued to do that throughout his life.
In Troy, Lafayette witnessed the positive economic effects of American republicanism. Promoting the cause of mankind generates wealth and prosperity. That's the underlying message. But the promise of that wealth should not become the privilege of the few. It should remain accessible to all, including women. To that end, his time in Troy was particularly valuable because it carried a unique message. For the American Republic to survive, the country needed an educated citizenry, one able to understand, practice, and protect the superior principles underpinning American republicanism. That's the story of Lafayette in Troy, a story of local and national resilience, a story of Western universalism, and of Republican education.